Hi everyone, welcome to this HBR Live Google Hangout, Using Empathy to Create Products People Love. I'm Jeff Kehoe, Senior Editor at Harvard Business Review. We're here to talk about creating products people love. On the one hand, with new tech and digital capabilities, it seems like almost anything's possible in terms of tweaking user experience. On the other hand, this technology context has created a really pressurized environment where product development is about getting to the minimum viable product, failing fast so you can get to the next round and hopefully reach success quicker. But our guest today has a different idea, and it involves some really distinctive ideas about design and about process. Jon Kolko is founder and director of the Austin Center for Design and Vice President of Consumer Design at Blackboard, Inc., a company focused on solving big problems and challenges in education and learning through technology and innovation. He's also the author of a terrific new book called Well Designed: How to Use Empathy to Create Products People Love. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Really quickly before we get started, I want to tell everyone that you can leave comments or questions in the Q&A box on the player as a comment on the event page or on Twitter with the hashtag HBRLive. We'll be monitoring these so that we can make this conversation as interactive as possible. So first, Jon, when you talk to different companies, clients, customers, and users, what would you say is the biggest problem or challenge that you see when it comes to creating products?
You know, it's an interesting question. It's actually a little bit surprising. The biggest problem seems to be actually shipping the product, getting the thing out the door at the end. And you wouldn't think that that would be problematic, but I think that there's a sense of sort of fear and uncertainty that comes when you get to the stage where you're about to unleash a new product into the world. And so many great products never see the light of day. I remember when I was a consultant at Frog Design, that was sort of one of the things we'd bemoan over and over was, you know, we'd work really hard on this thing, and at the end, for a number of reasons, but usually because of fear, the product would not make it to market. And I think that actually the fear comes from a lack of real belief in a story around why the product should exist. When you have when you have religion in the thing you made, it's a lot easier to sort of take that leap into that risky place where there is uncertainty. But if you don't have that scaffold to sort of lean on, you know, it's very easy to second and third guess yourself.
Say more about religion. You say when you don't have religion, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, so when you create an innovation, by definition, no one's ever seen it before, right? And so in many ways, you're talking and drawing and cajoling the idea into existence. And along those lines, everyone needs to believe in it so that they spend their time and energy, and in many cases, money on it. And so that religion is sort of having a sense of criteria that you can lean on and relate to say, I actually think this is the right product at the right time for people, and I want to go all the way through with launching it. And you know, I've seen a lot of hand-waving around statistics and quant data in order to create that scaffold of realism, but I don't believe it. And increasingly, as I see people sort of second and third guess those statistics, I actually think they're looking for something much more qualitative to believe in. And so one of the big drivers that we use in my world, and that's in the book you referenced, is this idea of empathy in order to create that story around why a product is useful and usable, why people will desire it, and why it should live in the world.
Yeah, I think I definitely want to get to empathy, which is really at the center of the book and of your way of thinking. But I also want to get to the context, too, which is problematic. And I mentioned that on the lead-in, where it seems like with all of the data that is available to us, and with all of the technological capability that we have, it's created this kind of very pressurized environment where everything is emphasizing speed and failing fast and iterating over and over again. And that seems to be in tension with empathy. So how do you focus on empathy? How do you keep empathy at the core in this kind of context?
It's a really good point, and it's a good question as well. There is sort of this pressure cooker, which I think is driven by a lot of the startup scene in San Francisco or Boulder or New York, that says, release now, like you're already too late. And there's this sense of urgency around getting the thing out. And I really actually think that that's a reaction to that same idea that I spoke of before, this fear, where products never launch because people aren't sure. So I think the intent is great there. That intention of get the product out quickly so that it gets out at all. What's problematic there is that the quality of sort of all of the big E's, engagement, experience, and emotion tend to get lost in that drive to launch something quickly, which means that you're going to be gathering data. Test and measure is sort of the relentless, underscore of that lean movement. But the data is not related to how people feel. And if you look at all of the different products, I think that are successful, that people love, that people integrate into their lifestyles, and that they really start to form an identity relationship with, those products resonate on, in some cases, an illogical level, right? They resonate in a much more emotional or heartfelt manner. And I don't think you get there through test and measure. I do think you get there through engagement with people. And so this whole leave the studio, get out of the office thing that Lean preaches, I'm completely aligned with. But what you do when you leave the office is very, very different.
Yeah, that's taking us in a nice direction. I want to get to one of the things that I love about your approach, and it's very much reflected in the book. It's one of the reasons why the idea of this book appealed to me so much, is that it's very much built around a process, sort of design thinking, which I want to talk about a little bit more later too, your ideas on that. But around a process that has these 4 key steps: determine product market fit, identify behavioral insights, sketch a product strategy, and polish the product details. So you were starting to mention about sort of getting out of the office and getting out there. And to me, that sort of means getting out into the market. So can you say a little bit more about these steps, and in particular that first step, the product market fit? What do you think about product market fit? How do you define the market?
Yeah, that's the starting point, and really 1 and 2 are sort of intertwined. But the idea of product market fit is making a product at the right time, at the right cost, on the right technological platform, and so on and so forth. I like to use an example to illustrate what happens when you miss. Google Glass is an interesting innovation, and I think people love to talk about it. But it's definitively strange. We're not ready for a cyborg sort of approach of people, wearing computers on their faces. And so the idea of it having mass adoption, product market fit, is going to miss, not because the technology is not ready. It may be, it may not be, but because there's a social norm that we actually have to bridge of people being ready to sort of integrate that into normal. But I'll give you a hint of how we're getting there, because I think it's naive to say it will never catch on. If you sort of back up about 3 years or 4 years, it was new and novel to see people with Bluetooth headsets in their ear, talking to themselves, and that's a computer on your face. Now it's a little more normal. I wouldn't say people love it. It's like, oh, who's that annoying guy talking on his Bluetooth headset? But it's a little bit more socially acceptable. And so we start to see this trail of signals of product adoption where technology becomes normalized. And really the word is humanized, right? It becomes part of what it means to be a human or part of the human experience. And so to get to product market fit, it's about having an innovation or an invention. It's about having great technology. But it's also about launching those things in line with that technological infrastructure where it makes sense. The other sort of side of this coin is launching at the right time for a government or a policy set of scaffolds. And we can see this playing out with ride sharing right now. You know, Uber is my sort of quintessential example of watching big money, big players actually change policy, right? Change the law in order to create product market fit. Because they have a wonderful product. I love using Uber. The experience is fantastic. The technology is really, really impressive, the scale at which they're able to operate. But if the laws are in the way, they can't run their business. And you can see smaller players, you know, go out of business. Some smaller players struggling, like Sidecar or Lyft. But then you see this sort of the 30,000-pound gorilla, you know, Google investing this massive amount of money, mostly to go lobby. Right?
That's a great point, thinking about sort of the policy context, the sort of structural context for the product and how important that is. Another point on the market, you talk about sensing signals from the market. And in the book you say we should develop and generate different kinds of artifacts around that. What do you mean by artifacts? What are the different kinds of artifacts?
Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about things, like many of us have meetings, right? We have meetings all day long, and we talk about things. And once you talk about things, they sort of disappear, right? They go into the ether, and maybe there's some knowledge or comprehension, but for the most part, the idea is lost. And so many times we leave a meeting not knowing what we talked about, and the next time you have the meeting, you have the same meeting again, and it's very much a Groundhog Day thing going on. And when you make a thing, when you draw an artifact, when you create a diagram, a visual representation, it serves a couple purposes. One is it grounds that meeting in reality, right? It says, this actually happened, and these are the things that were talked about or determined. But another is it aids in something called sense-making. Sense-making is both a personal and a collaborative activity of forming new knowledge. And since it's a shared activity, if we create this diagram together, we can actually generate knowledge together so that we both now have sort of a view of what reality is and what it should be. And if we can create a visualization of these signals, of this product market fit, of the conversation around that, then we can create alignment. And no matter if you work in a big company or a small company or a startup, that alignment is critical. It's critical to shipping products. If people aren't actually in lockstep and even more importantly, sort of in philosophical lockstep, the product's not going to succeed. And so the types of artifacts we build are diagrams, a 2x2, a customer journey map, a visualization of the sort of industry ecosystem. Like, it almost doesn't matter what the specific artifact is. What matters is that you're drawing it together, it's visual, and it's lasting, right? It's actual, it's not theoretical.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another interesting element in the book that's a part of what you're saying is the role of visual thinking. And you mentioned this just now in creating different kinds of visualizations. Is there anything more to what you mean by visual thinking?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's something that designers, architects, artists, whatever, have always sort of done because it's the way that they process. But increasingly, it's actually, I think, one of the only ways to manage the complexity of the constraints and systems that we're talking about. So let's use Uber as an example again. If you think about all the touch points that Uber has, even simplistically, they have an iOS app, they have an Android app, they have an iOS app for drivers, they have an Android app for drivers, they have a set of rules around cost, dynamic cost and pricing. They have a number of different product features and functions. You can't keep that all in your head at once. And so a visualization of that, a diagrammatic representation of it, actually serves to solidify it. It becomes the product strategy in many ways. And so everything we do, both in my educational world as well as in my professional world, is visual. the entire office is covered in whiteboards, and we constantly develop ideas and tear them back down, develop ideas and tear them back down. And that's challenging. It's challenging for a couple of reasons. We have a distributed team. We have people all over the world, and so they obviously can't see those whiteboards. We have to sort of translate that. Whiteboards don't necessarily capture time, right? It's definitive. It sort of blends and abstracts the interaction that got there. But even in spite of all of that, it's our go-to method for thinking through complexity. And so at the heart of a lot of the types of problems that we're talking about are working through ambiguity, working through a muddy sort of sense of non-clarity in order to come to a crispness. That's what visual thinking does.
Yeah, that touches on another point that struck me about your approach. When you talk about gathering signals from the market and sort of synthesizing and getting to behavioral insights about that, it made me think of big data. There's been such we're flooded with all kinds of data coming from all directions, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed in sort of trying to filter and synthesize that, and it seems like visual thinking is also perhaps an effective lens for and way of trying to do that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what you end up balancing is that once you actually get that product out the door, is this mess of data, right? You're marinating in it, and it's like you can track everything a person does, and so we lean heavily on those market signals that we talked about, as well as behavioral insights, which I assume we'll talk about soon, as sort of the vetting criteria for what of that behavioral data do we pay attention to and what is noise. Because if you think about it, even a simplistic product, let's say it does one thing, is just going to get a ton of data. You're going to find out about who uses it, how long do they use it, what features and functions do they use, what do they tap on, how long did they spend on each different page or section. And so you're sort of overwhelmed with this big data stuff, and you can find it in specific, and you can find it across different demographics or psychographics. And so we lean on this idea of market signals, that idea of technological precedent, as well as sort of political infrastructure, and the behavioral insights that again we'll talk about soon, in order to say which of this data is important to us, which should we completely ignore, and how do we ingest that data in order to inform future iterations of the product.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get to that. We've been putting it off long enough. How do you go from all of the signals and using visual thinking tools, and how do you then get down and crystallize these behavioral insights, which I think are really at the core of your approach?
Yeah, they are. I mean, to put a fine point on it, I think it's the most important part of the process. And if you have to cut everything else, if you still do this, there's some sort of magic that happens. A behavioral insight is a provocative statement of truth about human behavior. And so I'll sort of get into what that means. But the way we get there is through qualitative ethnographic research. What that means is we spend time with people and we watch them do things. And there's a subtle nuance there. Yeah, we ask them questions and we talk to them, but we're not doing an interview, and we're not saying, would you buy this? And we're not asking them to sort of predict their behavior in the future. Instead, we're saying, what do you do right now? Let us see it. And so I'll give you an example from my own world here at MyEDU and Blackboard, because it's sort of present in my thinking. I was at a startup called MyEDU, which helps college students succeed in college and get a job, and that was acquired by Blackboard back in December. At MyEDU, our focus was on students, and students are very strange. It's probably been a while since both of us were college students. And things have changed a great deal. Some things haven't changed, but things have changed a great deal. And so in order to understand, but better yet, in order to empathize with college students and get to behavioral insights, we spent time with them. We went in their dorm rooms, with their permission, obviously. We looked through their bags. We watched them do their homework. We had them, they registered for classes, and we observed that. We took tours of, their closets and things like that. And through that, and we did this with, these are 3 and 4 hour sessions with, 20 or 30 college students. you really start to empathize with what it's like to be a college student. I can understand what it's like to be a college student very academically by reading papers about it, by learning about statistics, by remembering my own experience. But that doesn't get me to what it's emotionally like to be a college student right now. And what it is emotionally like to be a college student right now is highly anxiety-ridden. College students are full of anxiety around really 3 or 4 core decisions. They're filled with anxiety around what school do I go to? Do I pick the right school? And then the next decision is, do I pick the right major? And there's full of anxiety around that. The sort of next decision in the path is, what classes should I take? Am I taking the right classes? And then finally, what's my job? What's the great job I'm going to get? And a big part of this is that we've sort of ingrained this artificial, oh, that's the magic process. It's this beautiful story of you go through college, you get a job, and you live happily ever after. And I'm not entirely sure that that's ever been true, but certainly not true now. And so college students are filled with anxiety. Anxiety doesn't tell us exactly what to build, but that can become a behavioral insight, because if we say students are anxiety-ridden, then our product should help them minimize anxiety, right? And so now we have an emotional sort of set of requirements upon which we can start to build a product. The utility can come from a couple of different places, right? That's going to come from those market signals. It's going to come from us saying, what is the product we want to build? And in our case, we help college students present themselves in a LinkedIn-style profile, but highly visual, and then we present it to college recruiters who want to hire them. And so that's what it does, but the way it feels has to be highly emotional, and so it's aligned with this idea of minimizing anxiety. It's a provocative statement of truth to say college students are anxious, because we can go find examples of college students that aren't anxious, right? We're making a gross generalization based on some really rigorous but biased field work, but then we're going to build on top of that scaffold in order to produce great emotionally resonant products.
Yeah, it sounds like the kind of closeness that you're talking about, and to get at that sort of emotional resonance, is a kind of ethnography. I mean, it reminds me of sort of cultural anthropologists going out and studying different groups and kinds of people over long periods to get really deeply sort of into their mindsets and their emotions. So it sounds very like that.
Yeah, it is. It's completely like that. And you could call it, I mean, an anthropologist would say it's a terrible bastardized version of what they do, right? But yeah, we draw from the social sciences because what we're getting at is not technology, and in many cases, it's not even business. You're getting at humans. You're getting at psychology. You're getting at behavior. You're getting at sort of identity and sort of what it means to be who I am, to form an identity. And products that are meaningful, products that people love, actually help them form who they are and communicate who they are to other people. And so it's you can't learn that from a table of numbers, right? You can't actually get that spirit of what it means by reading something. You have to go actually experience or spend time with people as they experience it. And a number of the specific methods absolutely build on anthropology.
Yeah, and sort of taking it one step farther to the tools that you use to learn when you're out there observing the group, the culture, what have you. I know there was a part in the book where you talked about the kinds of questions that you ask when you're gathering behavioral insights, and you note that there are good kinds of questions and bad questions. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and so if our intent is to observe real behavior, then bad questions become all of sort of the summary things, which unfortunately I think are what a lot of entrepreneurs use when they're pursuing a lean strategy. Would you buy this? Do you think this is a good idea? How much would you pay for it? These are all terrible questions. Even things like, tell me what you would normally do, tell me about how you usually do things, are all retrospective and they're not real, they're not rich. Good questions would be, show me. Or even better yet, let me try it, right? Imagine if you're doing research with taxi drivers because you happen to work at Uber or Lyft or Sidecar, to say, hey, can I drive the cab for a while? Right? It's totally bizarre. It's completely sort of socially nonsensical. And the answer might be no, right? It might be absolutely not. That's against policy. But imagine if the answer is yes, right? Now you get to actually experience what it's like to be a taxi driver, to understand the problems, the situations, and really to feel what it's like to be in that role. And that can start to inform that sort of emotional value proposition that you're building as a scaffold for your product.
Yeah, I want to get a little bit to, in taking on this approach, this design thinking mindset, what you think is the most important quality or habit. I want to sort of help the people who are watching think about what the first steps might be. And I remember in one of the excellent interviews, there are a bunch of terrific interviews that are in the book at the ends of chapters, and in one of them, Josh Ellman talks about getting out of your own head, as sort of an important quality. So maybe talk about that, and are there other sort of first steps that you would say for individuals in taking on this kind of design thinking mindset?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Josh is at Greylock, which invests in a lot of the startups that we know and love. And he previously worked at LinkedIn. Was a very early employee there. And what he says resonates actually with another sort of colloquialism or whatever you want to call it that we use frequently, which is the user is not like me. Right? The person that you're trying to support emotionally and functionally is not like you. By definition, if you're a person building products, and they're a person using products or consuming products, they don't understand or care about your go-to-market strategy, the market dynamics, product market fit, segmentation. All of that is nonsense. What they care about is their own life. They care about identity. They care about their goals and aspirations and dreams. And so to say, get out of your own head is exactly right. It's like, how can you view the world through somebody else's eyes? How can you literally walk in their shoes, or at least figuratively walk in their shoes? There's a catch-22 to this, which is subtle. Empathy is in many ways unachievable. You can't actually become somebody else, right? Because it's not just driving the taxi. You would have to have grown up where that person grew up and had all of the sort of cultural norms instilled in them and gone to the same school and had the same parents and had the same genetic background. So it's impossible. But it's a spectrum, right? And if you're over here, right, and the person that you're trying to empathize with is over here, you can move between that spectrum by doing this qualitative research, by asking open-ended questions, show me why, can I see an example, and by actually trying whatever it is that they're doing. And so if we think of empathy as a spectrum and your goal is to get as close to the other person as possible, that's sort of this idea of seeing the world, spinning around and seeing the world through their eyes.
Yeah. Really valuable quality, I think, in this context and many other contexts. So moving a level upward from, the individual and the qualities that the individual has to have to truly become empathetic and take on this design thinking mindset. What about teaching and sort of disseminating this approach amongst an organization? For instance, for leaders who are out there in the audience of different groups or organizations, how do you embed this kind of approach in corporate culture?
Yeah, that's a great question that I'm sort of living right now. As I mentioned, MyEDU was acquired by Blackboard, and I think many of us have probably used Blackboard, highly successful educational technology company that has never really had to worry about the types of things we're talking about, empathy and emotion, because our software was previously sold based on a checklist of features. We would go to a CIO of a large institution. They would say it needs to do these 10 things, and we would say, okay, then it does these 10 things, and here's your software. Give us lots of money. And the educational landscape's changing. Students are increasingly actually the person who makes the decision about what product to use. It's not some anonymous administrator. And since they have that volition, they're much more selective, right? They expect all products to work as well as Instagram or Facebook. And it's like, well, hey, it's an educational tool. And they're like, I'm sorry, I'm used to as easy to use as Instagram is, or so that's sort of my baseline expectation. And so we need to instill into a company that's been highly successful, highly profitable, with many people who are very committed to education, a change in the way you think about products and the change in the way you think about users or the people who you're servicing with your products. The company is full of extraordinarily well-intentioned people, yet it's difficult because you need to unlearn a way of thinking that's been successful and relearn a new way of thinking, which is sometimes called a shift from enterprise to consumer, right? A shift from building features to trying to leverage, again, those E's, that emotion and empathy and engagement and experience. The way that we've been doing it, that we've had a lot of success with, is sort of two things. One is we've gotten extraordinarily lucky because we have executive buy-in to begin with. The acquisition of MyEDU was a purposeful shift in the business strategy to focus on students. And so, the C-suite is saying, we value this thing. Like, that's why we bought you, among other things. And so that's extraordinarily helpful, and I'm not sure how you get there other than sort of a long, arduous push uphill. The other is that those artifacts that we've been talking about, that we previously talked about, these diagrams and visual representations, become the way that you socialize this throughout a large organization. They become the communication vehicle for that engagement, that emotion, and really that sort of empathetic perspective. And the best examples that I found are actually videos and quotes of the real people, because you want everybody else to sort of move from that I'm me and I'm trying to empathize over here, but they don't get the benefit of doing that anthropological research. And so how can you get them a little bit closer by letting them know what it's like to be that college student? And so verbatim quotes from college students and video and imagery really starts to tell the story of why we're making this shift and how our products, services, and go-to-market strategy need to change in order to fit that change.
I want to shift quickly. We have a good question here from the Twitter feed. What are the best practices you could share for building products that have educational purposes? So maybe some specific examples of best practices in the kind of space that you're working in with Blackboard.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'll lean on this idea of anxiety minimization. And so we're seeing a big shift in this push toward outcomes, which I'm sure is not new to anybody who's in the educational space, tracking accreditation compliance, tracking the quality of student work, and then ultimately tracking whether or not students get jobs. And again, all of those three things are tied to that notion of anxiety. So, I think one of the keys for building educational software is actually to recognize that education happens in a ecosystem. It's an ecological way of thinking. It's not a point, right? And so a student experiences an academic journey, and a product, even a small utility product, has to understand and acknowledge that longer story. Education is not unique in that way. This is true about pretty much every industry, every segment, every vertical that I've ever seen or experienced. Point solutions, this idea of thinking of something in isolation, it's just not an effective way of thinking about how people experience products and systems. And so any way that you can actually paint a picture or a narrative of how your thing fits into the larger story, that larger emotional journey, is an effective way of driving this empathetic point of view.
Great. We've also got an interesting question from John here in the Q&A box. You mentioned empathy for products, end users, and clients, coworkers through either shared drawings in meetings or getting out of the office for interaction. Who is it shared with? Yeah. Do you see that? Do you see that question? Mm-hmm.
I actually can't see the question box, but it's a great question. You're really sharing it with everyone, and it seems kind of like a punt, like I'm punting to say that, but you're sharing it with your team, right? You're sharing all of these concepts with your team. You're sharing them with the organization, but to do this the best, you're sharing them with the end users. You're actually sharing them with the people you're designing with, rather than designing for. And all of the techniques that I've been talking about actually work better if the people who will use your product, will buy your product, will experience your product, are involved in the actual design process. If you think about it, it changes the nature of what it means to be a designer, a developer, a marketer, or whatever your role is. You become a facilitator, right? In many ways now you have to be better at teaching people your methodology or the types of activities you're doing, and then facilitating their way to creativity, their way to innovation, or their way to articulating the emotional needs that they have, because they're not designers, they're not technologists, they're not marketers. They're really intimate with themselves, with their own wants and needs, but they don't know the first thing about bringing products to market. So you teach them, and then you facilitate that process.
Yeah, that's really great. I'd have to say one of the things that also appealed to me about this approach, the more I learned about it, was that in effect, it kind of democratizes product management. And I thought there was a great quote from the book, which I'll just quickly say. It recognizes and celebrates creativity in all people involved in product development, not just the people who wear black turtlenecks or horn-rimmed glasses.
I should have worn my horn-rimmed glasses for this conversation. No, that's exactly right. Democratization is exactly the right word. You know, everybody who talks about product management in old enterprise contexts talks about the product owner, right? One person is definitively in charge of what is in the product, when does the product ship, what are the right strategic decisions. And increasingly, if you look at the way .coms work and talk to the product managers at Etsy and Instagram and Facebook, and pick your successful consumer product, they talk about the product manager as the center of a wheel, like the hub of a wheel, communicating with all the people on the spokes. Right? They talk about them as a shepherd, or they talk about them as a facilitator, sort of moving the entire organization forward. One of the best quotes I got from one of the guys I talked to in the book was this idea that somebody who's a good product manager is affable. Right? That means everyone likes them. They want to be around them. They want to share their ideas with them, and then that person is able to pull all of these ideas together and synthesize them. And it is, to your point, it's a really different view of how creativity happens, how innovation happens, and it does recognize this idea that it's somewhat ubiquitous, but people need the skills and tools to get there.
Yeah, well, and I have to say, I'll mention the very brief cameo that you were kind enough to put me into the book, because I had shared with you that realization of my own as a book editor, that the more I got into this approach and learned about it, it occurred to me that the creation of books as a product definitely fits into this framework, and I'm a product manager. All of these principles apply to everything that I do every day, and it also made me think about sort of the application of these principles across many different contexts. There was one comment on LinkedIn yesterday prior to this Google Hangout that mentioned healthcare, and I was curious about if you've seen any interesting or distinctive kinds of applications in healthcare yourself, but it certainly seems like a context where this approach would play very well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to your point, we are all product managers. I don't know, that might be too grandiose to say, but in many ways, if you think about it, we're all trying to work forward. We're all trying to get other people to understand our ideas. We're all trying to manage complexity because the world is strange and complex and ambiguous. I mean, all of those are skills or things that a product manager fights with all the time. It might not be called a product. It might be called a service. It might be called, in your case, a book. But yeah, totally. All of these skills are generalizable. I mean, as an aside, maybe these are the skills we should be teaching people in K-12 education, right? If this is the future of the world, maybe these are reading, writing, arithmetic, the fundamentals of like empathy, visual thinking, and so on and so forth. But anyway, that is an aside. On the healthcare thing, a friend of mine, a guy named Hugh Dubberly, has talked a lot about healthcare and he likes to concept map out these crazy diagrams of systems. And he has this wonderful theory, which I think is exactly dead on, that we're moving, or have already moved in many cases, to treating an acute illness to a holistic sense of wellness. And when you think of healthcare in terms of wellness, you start thinking about it in terms of democratizing design, right? Offloading decision making to people, having them be, have more volition or control. You get into things like open data records, open medical records, the idea of a relationship between a healthcare provider and a person, rather than this this figurehead, institutionalized doctor who has all of the knowledge, and they give it to you in pieces. And it is, I mean, in many ways, it's like, oh, it's unicorns and fairies and rainbows. I am really optimistic that if you can apply a lot of this stuff in those contexts, you get to a much more human approach to healthcare. And I think there's innovations coming out of all the big players, Mayo, Cleveland Clinic. Cleveland Clinic was a client at Frog when I was there. They're all starting to struggle with and embrace this way of thinking.
Yeah, it makes me think of something you say at the beginning of the book that I think is threaded throughout it. When you say, the product has to have a personality, that, to me, the big question and sort of what you get at through your process is how do you give your product personality? So, maybe say a little bit about what you mean by giving the product a personality and how that functions in your framework.
Yeah, it's funny to think about, right? It's like products aren't people; they're things. Corporations aren't people, whatever. But in fact, we create human relationships with the artifacts we have. And you can catch yourself or other people saying things like, "Oh, I love my whatever. I love my Jetta. Right? I love my Nike shoes." And that's a pretty strange thing to say, right? I love a pair of leather that costs $120 that has some cotton or whatever plastic. It's very sort of strange to say, but as long as there's been industrial design, assembly, production, and things like that. Mass production, there's been this idea that products serve both utilitarian functional role, but also a really emotional role in our lives, and we start to see ourselves in them. And I think this idea of embedding a personality in a product actually goes back to like what is the product strategy, what is the company strategy, and really what is the core values of the people building the stuff. Because the emotional quality or identity or personality you would embed in your product if you work at Volkswagen is extraordinarily different than if you work at Lexus. And that's because the people who buy a Volkswagen or buy a Lexus have different expectations about how they see themselves in those products, right? It's a mirror of myself, and all of those sort of emotive adjectives that follow, like, oh, Lexus, luxury, affluence, opulence, oh, Volkswagen, fun, quirky, whimsy.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to say one other thing about maybe it's along the lines of democratization, and it has to do with the existing roles that people play in their organizations or in their firms, whatever they are, and where they're coming from with regard to an approach like this. And I remember something you had said earlier on, maybe it was even in the proposal, the first book proposal, but it was about how people think of product development in sort of skewed ways, where they think of product management in these two sort of demarcated ways, with product development on the one hand, sort of tech and engineering, and sort of marketing ideas on the other, brand management. And I feel like your approach really sort of integrates those two into a much more kind of cohesive, holistic approach to design thinking and product development.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that. If you look at Microsoft or Google, they're clearly driven by extraordinarily smart people, right? Engineers, the top of your class, computer science, understand at an extraordinarily intimate level how the technology stack works. And so it's no surprise that if product managers arise from that culture, they're going to optimize for things like algorithms and speed and functionality and capabilities and features. And on the other side of things, if you look at the Procter & Gamble's or the J&J's of the world, they're driven by that same sort of like extraordinarily smart business people, right? People who have trained in marketing or sales, who understand pricing data, who understand product launches of physical products and store relationships and white goods and purchasing and things like that. And so they're going to optimize, obviously, on the way that consumers experience the product when they buy it, right? They're going to optimize on the story or strategy around getting the product to market. And I'm not sure if it's an integration, another way of thinking, a blend, whatever, a Venn diagram, but this third way of thinking that focuses on people actually sort of says, you know what, people don't care about technology, and they don't necessarily care about your marketing story. They care about integration, right? They care about, again, how they see themselves in the product, how the product integrates into their life. And fundamentally, they care about things like, how does it make me feel? What does it allow me to do? How does it help me? And help could be, how does it help me get through life? How does it help me achieve my dreams? We're seeing a change in expectations. We can blame it on a lot of things. You blame it on the iPhone, right? But consumers are more expectant. They expect products to cater to their human needs now, not just to a technological feature set or a list of marketing requirements.
I think that's a great note to end on, sort of inspirational note. I think we're just about out of time, and I just want to say great questions and a great conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and to thank everyone for all their good questions. And Jon Kolko, thanks very much for being here and for a great conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much for encouraging me to do this, and obviously for publishing the book, Jeff.
And the last thing I'll say is you can find Jon's book, Well Designed, How to Use Empathy to Create Products People Love, on Amazon and also on hbr.org. Thanks again, everyone.